Anin, Shauna Nindigena Kaz Jaganashing Mung, Idesh Gijekwe Nindigo Ojibwemung, Makwa Nindodame, Adawa Zaga Iganin Ijinikate Ishkonigan Winjabayan. Welcome and thank you for joining me at these Section 17 corporations, using the past to structure your business for the future. My name is Shauna Coons. I am the managing attorney at Quay Law Firm, and we are based here in Minnesota, just north of St. Paul, and it's a pretty cold and chilly, snowy day up here in Minnesota. So hopefully you're having some better weather than we are. I have been working in federal Indian law for over 10 years, although I've really dedicated my entire career to working in Indian country and supporting Indian communities. I did my undergrad at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, and I focused in sociology and American Indian studies. After graduating, I went to work as an Indian child welfare social worker for the Fond du Lac Band of Ojibwe. I did that for a short time and then went on to law school, where I went to William Mitchell College of Law. I was really fortunate at Mitchell, and I was able to create an Indian law program by taking courses through some of the other nearby law schools. After graduation, I clerked in state court for a brief time and then got a job with the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe as a deputy solicitor general. And while working for the band, like many tribal attorneys, I got a lot of experience in a variety of different areas, but what really interested me was the work in housing and community development. After working there for about 4.5 years, I moved on to private practice, worked at a mid-sized firm and then eventually a boutique Indian law firm. And I really enjoyed this aspect of my practice because I was able to not only continue working with tribal governments and their businesses, but to get a lot more experience and dedicate my practice to more of that economic development, real estate, business and governance work. And that's when I discovered I really had a passion for tribal real estate issues. One of the projects that I have worked on has been a presentation at prior conferences here and is in the National Tribal Land Association archives. It was the LCO Reservation Proclamation. And in that project, we had over 2,000 acres added and proclaimed as reservation land for Lakota. Lakota is my tribe. It's located in Hayward, Wisconsin, which is kind of northern Wisconsin area. But it was just a really exciting project to see the reservation boundaries be expanded and have all that additional land added to the reservation for my children and future generations. Another project we recently worked on was here in Minnesota, and it involved the National Park Service, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the State Historic Preservation Officer, the Minnesota Historical Society. And in that project, those agencies all approved, and the Minnesota Historical Society transferred a parcel of land back to the Lower Sioux Indian community. And this has a lot of historical significance because that site is the location of the former Lower Sioux Agency. And that was the location for the start of the U.S.-Dakota War in 1862, and which is the result of many broken treaty promises. And then after the war, resulted in the largest mass execution in United States history. So this was very significant that the state and the Historical Society were transferring this land back to the Lower Sioux Indian community. It really signified a moment of healing for the community. So this information can be found on the Lower Sioux Indian community's web pages if you would like more information about that. But so those are some of the real estate projects that I really get excited to work on. And one of those also is this Section 17 corporation. This is something that I was able to do with the Lakota, with my tribe, related to a golf course project. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the process to create a Section 17 corporation. We will go over what they are, some reasons why you might want to create a Section 17, and the process working with the BIA in order to form a Section 17 corporation. I do have some information on Section 17 statistics. However, the information was, I don't have the 2020 results yet. The information is based on 2019. And however, with the pandemic in the last year, I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers have kind of stayed stable since then, but we will touch on those a little later. So what is a Section 17? It is the opportunity for a tribe to create a separate business entity, and it was included in part of the Indian Reorganization Act. So you may recall the Indian Reorganization Act authorized and created a process for tribes to establish tribal governing entities. It provided kind of a model constitution which tribes could vote to apply, and was just one way that a tribe could organize itself. So another part of that process was to allow tribes to create what has been called a Section 17 entity. It still has some kind of paternalistic feelings to it, because it does require the tribe to petition to the Secretary of Interior for approval to create the Section 17 entity. The statute that you see before you outlines the authority that could be provided to a tribe with a Section 17. And it also kind of provides some direction on what a Section 17 entity can do. So through the adoption of this, you still have Congress and the Secretary of Interior kind of taking that paternalistic approach of saying, this is what your Section 17 will look like, and this is the authorities and powers that the Section 17 will have. And unfortunately, that statute hasn't changed since 1934. So that's still in place and the model that we're still working with. If you're coming from Oklahoma, it's a little different there. In Oklahoma, they have the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, which sets out the process to create a business entity there. So we're not going to get into those specific details because that's a little bit different. One thing that I think is very interesting to note is even if your tribe has not adopted a Section 16 tribal government and hasn't organized under that model IRA constitution, the tribe can still utilize the Section 17 portion of the IRA, and they can still adopt a Section 17 corporation. Another thing that's quite interesting about this is when some tribes were adopting the IRA model constitution, they were simply given a Section 17 corporation. This happened when the tribe didn't even petition for a corporation, but it was simply a small, there was about a page and a half model template that existed in 1934, and it was just opened up and created in the tribe's name. So, a tribe may not have intended to enter the business market in this manner, and here they were being forced with a Section 17 corporation. So that still results in some issues and some confusion for those tribes that were forced into having one, and if they are now looking to engage in business practices through other corporations. But it's just a really interesting piece of history that happened there. So what is a Section 17? I've gone through and pulled out what are some of the key language in that statute. Again, you'll see that paternalistic approach by the tribe being required to petition the Secretary of Interior to seek approval for this. So the process is a little bit burdensome on the tribe because not only do they draft the charter and then petition the Secretary of Interior, once it goes through the whole process, the tribe has to then review the Section 17 a second time and ratify the charter. So it's multiple times that the tribe is going to be looking through and issuing resolutions approving this charter. The tribe can set up a Section 17 entity and give it very broad rights for the powers and authorities it's going to have. One of the big benefits is the rights to own, manage, and dispose of certain kinds of property, and virtually unlimited authority when it's dealing with fee simple lands. So we'll get into a little bit of that later. But a Section 17 entity can have the authority to convey, encumber, and lease trust or restricted lands on the reservation. And this was only limited to a 25-year period. Another thing that's really interesting about that is the statute there identifies the limitations of that 25-year term for the Section 17 that's going to be doing conveyancing, encumbering, or leasing of those trust and fee lands. But they were very clear that they said it was on the reservation. And the statute is silent as to trust lands off the reservation. I would not be surprised if the Secretary of Interior took that status, that 25-year limitation, and applied it to all trust lands, regardless of where located. But it's interestingly enough, it was silent in the original statute. Section 17 entity can also be given broad authority to conduct business and operate as an entity. One of the final key provisions that's important to note is the winding down and terminating of the entity. It's very difficult to do and requires a specific act of Congress to terminate a Section 17 entity. So there's both pros and cons to that. This is good because the entity will continue in existence for perpetuity and cannot be administratively dissolved like a state statute can. However, this might be difficult, or a con is that in the event that a tribe did want to dissolve its Section 17 entity, it can't simply just dissolve it. It needs an act of Congress to dissolve it. So you could end up with what's considered an inactive charter, where the tribe has essentially abandoned its Section 17 entity, is no longer operating it, but the charter has not been formally terminated yet. So those are just a few of the things to consider when deciding whether or not you want to create a Section 17 and incorporate. Another thing is, because it is going to be in perpetuity, unless you seek that act of Congress, if you're creating one, you might want to consider giving it some broad authority so that if later on down the road you decide that the tribe decides it wants to change the business focus of its entity, you may want to have a broad charter so that you're not going back to amending the charter to change from the authority that was originally outlined in it. So we'll get into some of the specific reasons and for forming a Section 17. There's many business considerations that would support going with a Section 17 or support going with a different entity. But one of the benefits of a Section 17 is that separation of business from tribal government. So when you have your tribe operating in those different divisions, typically you're going to have the tribal government focused on programs and services for the community. The goals will be slightly different there. There could be a focus in providing community health care, child protection, housing, really government programs to support the community's survival. Whereas you might have the business entity would be focused on generating income, competing in its market or industry for whichever area it's acting. And so those goals may be quite different from what the tribal government's goals could be. And at times you might have a conflict between the operations from the tribal government and what they're trying to achieve and what the tribal business entity is trying to achieve. So that could be a really strong reason for doing this separation and creating these separate boards, so that you remove some of those conflicts and both can focus on the goals within their divisions. There has been a good amount of research on this separation as well. There have been different Native business institutes that have acknowledged the benefits of separating business from government. So there's models that have been out and research done on specific examples, showing how successful a tribal business can be when it is separated out and set up as its own specific entity. Another really wise business decision for creating Section 17 is it is a very effective way of protecting your tribal assets. When you set up your Section 17 business, it will have its own assets and it will be considered separate and distinct from the tribe. So that way the tribe's assets and the tribe's general fund will stay under the general umbrella of the tribe, and the business will stay under the business's general umbrella, and those can be separate. So there can be some really great benefit to that, but yet then your Section 17 is still considered connected to the tribe. If you're not looking for a complete separation between the tribe and the tribal government and the business, one way you can do that is allow some oversight by the tribal council. And you can write that into your tribal charter through reporting requirements, whether that's simply to allow or require the Section 17 to report to tribal council monthly, quarterly, or for instance, annual reports to the entire membership. There's a lot of freedom and leeway for how you want to structure that. So you do have those benefits to still include some of that oversight over your Section 17 while keeping it separate from the tribal government. Another way to look at keeping some of that connection is including some of the tribal membership or the tribal council as the members of the board for the Section 17 entity. That could be identifying specific roles, such as the tribal council secretary may have a seat on the Section 17 board, or it could be identifying who from the tribal council is going to have a non-voting seat on the Section 17 board, and just for the matter of being informed of what's happening with that entity. It could go as far as your tribal council is all of the members from the tribal council would also be members of the board for your Section 17 entity. You would then have a situation where your tribal council would be coming in, doing their tribal governance work and wearing their hat as a tribal council, but then they would also be then concluding those tribal council meetings and reconvening as the Section 17 board, and then they would have to put on their hat as the board of the Section 17 entity and kind of change the approach slightly. So there's ways to have as much separation between the tribal governance and tribal business, or there's also ways to kind of make some of those connections. And so you need to explore what's going to be a good relationship for your tribe. One of the really huge benefits of Section 17 is the sovereign immunity aspects. So a Section 17 entity can share in the full sovereign immunity of the tribe, and that can be extended over the Section 17 to protect them and their assets as well. So that's not only a great way to protect the tribe's assets, but also the corporation's assets. Otherwise, when you're creating the Section 17 entity, If you don't want to provide the Section 17 with that full sovereign immunity, and that's the protection from suit, and the protection of its assets and the entity, then you can also clearly spell out if you're going to allow the Section 17 corporation to waive its sovereign immunity. So what you would do in this situation is, you could identify in your charter exactly what the process is for when the Section 17 corporation would be waiving its immunity and how that is going to be done. So you could limit it to stating specifically where the corporation can be sued, whether you want that to state the corporation can be subject to suit only in your tribal court, whether you want the corporation to also be subject to suit in tribal court and federal court. You can identify that in your charter. You could also identify what assets could be used to satisfy judgments, whether it's just going to be a corporation that's working in real estate, and you're going to identify that specifically its real estate assets could satisfy judgments, or whether it's just the incomes or other specific transactions, if they're going to be pledging certain assets, that only those can be used when waiving sovereign immunity, and those can be the only means of satisfying judgments. You could also identify the process for waiving sovereign immunity in the charter, whether that is to say that it has to go before the corporation, the Section 17 corporation's board, and if it's a simple majority who has to approve for a waiver, whether it's a supermajority or whether it has to be a unanimous consent. You can set those thresholds in your charter on how sovereign immunity can be waived. If you want to further limit when sovereign immunities can be waived, you can also set up a Section 17 corporation that requires a concurrent approval by tribal council. And so in that situation, you would have not only your corporate board passing a resolution to approve waiving its sovereign immunity, but then they would have to present that to the tribal council and obtain tribal council approval to waive sovereign immunity as well. So you can clearly outline that process in your charter so that it's well understood and governing how your board is going to be acting. Conversely, you can just put in your charter that there is a blanket waiver of the entity's immunity, so that there would not be any question that the board could be entering into contracts, or that the corporation could enter into contracts which the board would approve that may include those provisions such as choice of law, choice of forum, and the opportunity to sue and be sued in other venues. And so those could be clearly stated in the entity's charter. So there's a lot of ways to look at that sovereign immunity and what's going to be the best fit for your business entity, for your tribal community, and for the goals that you have. Another one of the really good benefits is the tax status. A Section 17 corporation does share in the federal tax exemption that the tribe has. This has been reviewed by the Internal Revenue Service. There's a series of Department of Revenue rulings from 1994 and some tax court cases which have upheld this. So there's some really significant tax benefits that a Section 17 corporation can have. That may be a reason to create a corporation. One of the areas that really excites me is the flexibility and opportunity for land transactions that a Section 17 corporation has. Generally, this type of a corporation is going to have more authority to manage and convey lands than what a tribe is generally going to have. You may be familiar with the process that a tribe has to go through if they want to, lease or encumber lands, there's countless regulations in place that a tribe has to comply with and work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs if they're going to be doing some of those land management transactions. But the authorizing statute for the Section 17 corporation, on the face of it, specifically authorize these corporations to sell and convey land without further receiving additional Secretary of Interior approval. So, like we mentioned earlier, the limitation was on trust and restricted fee lands that are on the reservation that may end up getting extended to those trust lands off the reservation. And it's a 25-year term. But when the Bureau of Indian Affairs is reviewing the corporation and considering whether to provide that authorization and approve Section 17 charter, that is when they're considering whether to authorize this entity to engage in these land transactions. And so once that Section 17 is approved, it then has the Secretary of Interior approval needed to do any other land transactions. So the result is you have a corporation that's owned by a tribe that can purchase, that can encumber and mortgage and lease its lands, manage the lands how it needs to. It does not need to obtain additional Secretary of Interior approval. It can then also dispose of lands without obtaining Secretary of Interior approval. So this can be a really great benefit depending on what business your Section 17 entity is looking to enter. The one that I had worked on was going to be acquiring some residential properties that were to be developed and then intended to be sold. So for us, it made great sense to use a Section 17 so that we weren't constantly having to go back to the Secretary of Interior to sell these parcels. So when you're considering what type of real estate authority and what type of real estate transactions that you want your Section 17 to engage in, you'll want to clearly spell that out in your charter so that it's stated there. And that can be very broad authority as recognized in the statute. If there are any questions or issues that come up, those will be uncovered during the BIA process, and the BIA will reach out and follow up if they have concerns about what the intent of the language is. So again, one of the common themes we've been talking about is just the flexibility and the opportunities with Section 17s. And you'll see that as well for business transactions. So one of the key reasons to create a Section 17, obviously, is to engage in commerce and to operate as a business. So the tribe can establish an entity and give it broad authority and be very specific in the powers that the entity will have to act within those certain industries. You can outline that the entity has the ability to take out loans and to mortgage property and to mortgage its assets. Another thing that you can look at identifying, and these were things that were specifically called out in our Section 17 as to whether we had intended to include this or not, but whether or not you want to create an entity that has the authority then to charter separate sub-entities or multiple sub-entities. But that will need to be clearly stated in your charter. So in that situation, you may have a tribe that's forming a Section 17 for the purpose of creating its general umbrella economic development corporation. And the purpose of the economic development corporation may be to charter separate businesses to focus in certain industries. So your economic development corporation may then charter another entity, which is going to have a landscaping business for the Section 17. And that economic development corporation may charter another entity that will engage in other areas of commerce, such as running, the C-stores for the business, for the tribe. But what you're doing there is you're creating your one Section 17 umbrella business, which is then going to manage all the other businesses for the tribe, and you're keeping them all under one entity. That's just one model to look at for using a Section 17 process. But what it does is then you have this formalized business governance for your entity. You have the formal charter. You're likely going to be adopting some bylaws, and you're setting your business up to be well positioned to engage in other business markets with its governing tools in place. And those will be governing tools that other businesses and industries will be familiar with. Finally, one of the things you can do is obtain a certificate of good standing from the BIA, and that can be useful if your Section 17 corporation is going to be applying for loans and financing, and may need to show that the entity is in good standing. So we saw the language of the statute earlier on one of the slides, and it left a lot of open area for how it's going to, how the BIA is going to work with Section 17s. So there was no clear process outlined on what the BIA was going to be reviewing and looking for in the review process, and what the procedure was for approving a Section 17 corporation. So doing our procedure, we boiled it down to really there's about 7 key steps in the process. So we'll get into what those steps are. So again, the statute didn't really identify what a clear process was, but it's going to start with, the tribe drafting their charter and drafting their initial documents, and then sending a petition to the BIA to create a Section 17 corporation. Depending on how your region's set up, it could go through local review at an agency office, and then get sent out to the regional office for their review. Then the regional office at that point would likely reach out to the Office of Solicitor at the Department of Interior to get legal review of the documents. There'll be a lot of internal memos going on at that point. And then it would bounce back to the regional office, who would issue a letter to the tribe. And at that point, you're kind of at that 5th step where the tribe then can make corrections and comments. And once they've completed that part, it goes back to the regional director for review. And when the regional director approves it, then the final step is going back to the tribe for ratification of a charter. So let's break down those 7 steps. Again, the first one is going to be the tribe's legwork of drafting its charter and putting together its petition. There was no template petition, specific items that needed to be included in this process. You can do some searching online through the various search engines, and there are a couple Section 17 corporate charters out there that can serve as models. I believe there was a federal Department of Energy, Indian Energy, that has a charter out there. It's quite lengthy, and it does have some key pieces that you need to review and consider for your specific tribe. But there could be something, if you do a little search, you'll find some guidance. When you find one of those, you definitely need to be specific and think about how it can be tailored to your tribe and its goals for its business. So make sure whatever template you may come across and that you're using, that you're going to be reviewing it and revising it, looking at it in comparison to your tribal constitution to see, are there any unique limitations in the tribal constitution or unique procedures in the tribal constitution that need to impact your section 17. Also, as you're going through, be sure you look at the charter, because some of the ones that are out online do have some inconsistencies. So you'll want to look at those just to make sure that everything is clear across the document. What we've learned through the process was some of the areas that there are some key areas that the BIA is going to be asking about, and rightfully so. So one of those big key areas is, first identifying what's the purpose of this entity, and stating that in there, what the business is going to be, whether that's just general business development, and economic development, or if it's going to be very narrow and specific, such as this business is being created to manage a golf course, or this business is being created to operate a chain of movie theaters. But identify that. Another key provision to outline is how the business is going to be managed, whether it's going to be member managed and include tribal council, whether it's going to have a separate board that's going to be managed it, or whether it's going to be managed by a separate manager who reports to a board. So you'll want to clearly identify the management structure and how authority will relate between the boards, the management, and the tribe. You'll also want to identify very clearly authority and the board or the management entity will have in making decisions and engaging in business. When it's done, you will have a charter that will look like it's a charter and bylaws that have been merged into one document. They get kind of lengthy, whereas, in some states, a corporate charter is just a simple 1.5-page document. You can end up with a Section 17 charter that can have 20 pages of direction on how this business is going to be operated. So that clarity can be beneficial, though, to your entity. So at that point, you have your draft charter. Then you need to have your tribal resolution. And your tribal resolution will reference the authority in federal law. So again, citing to that Section 17 statute, and then also reference the authority in the tribal constitution for the tribe to create this business entity. You'll also want to include a best interest statement stating that the tribe has determined it's in the best interest of the community to create this Section 17 corporation. And then finally, you want to be sure that your tribal resolution approves and authorizes the submission of the charter and petitioning to the BIA for issuance of a charter. So again, the statute says the tribe petitions, but there's no formal process, or the BIA hasn't created any specific petition. So what you'll do then is the tribe will draft a cover letter that can be used as its petition, and then just include in there the specific language that the tribe is petitioning the Bureau of Indian Affairs for a charter, and then you'll include an unsigned draft of that charter, and you'll include that resolution. And that'll be your packet. That is the petition that goes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So then step 2 is the agency review. Depending on your region, if you don't have a local agency and just have a regional office, it might be slightly different. But one thing to consider in these process is to engage the BIA early. Give them a heads up that you're working on this. Let them know of any timeframes that you may have. That can be a great benefit to you in viewing the BIA as your partner, because ultimately you're going to need their approval for this charter. So one thing I've always found is when you work together, you can accomplish more. So we had reached out to the BIA and given them a heads up that this was coming. So then they were able to do some internal work on their end to prepare to review a Section 17 charter. Our agency hadn't seen one in quite some time, so they had to familiarize themselves with their requirements. So at the local level, it went to the tribal operations specialist. And we had some discussions with that person just to give them a heads up overview of this is what the charter is, why we're doing it. Then the tribal operations specialist prepares a memorandum, which is going to be an internal memo that was issued by the superintendent and goes to the regional office. So again, having some of those internal discussions, we were also able to request our superintendent to give our regional office a heads up that this was coming, so they knew to expect it. And we were able to kind of manage some of the timeframes and deadlines and set up meetings so that we could keep this moving through the process. Because it does take several months. We had an expedited one, and we were able to work this through, I think it was about, in total, probably 6 months from when we started drafting it to when we got it approved. But I understand that there have been Section 17s that have been going through a review process and several draft revisions for much longer than that. So then it goes from the agency office to the regional office for their review. And one thing to remember too is with that Section 17 statute, it is again kind of limited into what type of authority and what the review process is. But on the positive side, there's no clear criteria in there for the BIA to reject them. So in our experience, what the BIA found was that they're really limited to ensuring that the charter doesn't expand on the corporation's rights beyond what's authorized in federal law. And that's pretty narrow. So they wanted to ensure that the corporation cannot transfer land into trust without Secretary of Interior approval. Also to ensure that the corporation cannot sell trust land. Otherwise, they were just reviewing it to, again, make sure it wasn't going beyond any lawfully authorized business practices. So one of the key practice tips here was during this process, we did engage our tribal council and our tribal chairperson. We found that if we weren't getting responses immediately from the BIA, that we utilized and leaned on our chairperson to send additional letters, place additional phone calls, or when they were at other meetings with the BIA, to just take a moment and ask questions. Hey, where are you at on that charter? So by keeping that dialogue open, we were able to, stay really on top of this review process. So as it's at the regional office, then the BIA will issue another internal memo, and then it'll seek its legal review. So now you're at step 4 of the process. At this point, your charter has going over to the Office of the Solicitor, who is going to conduct their legal review. And the solicitor's office represents the BIA. So they're going to be making sure the BIA isn't acting outside of its authority. So you, depending on how much you may have different levels of interaction with the solicitor's office. If you're lucky, you might be able to find out who the attorney is at the solicitor's office that is reviewing the charter. You might find out what their time frame is, and maybe even be able to speak with them and answer any questions they might have about the charter. We had very little information, but we were able to convey to the Department of Interior that this was a priority, and we had support of the regional office saying that this was a priority and needs to be expedited. So we did get through legal review pretty quickly. After that, the the BIA will then be issuing its technical comment letter. So it's going to take all those comments it's received from the agency, local agency office's internal memo, from the regional office's internal memo, and from the guidance that they received from the solicitor. And they'll put that all together and send that to the tribe in a technical comment letter. Our technical comment letter was 8 pages long, and it's going to cover all types of comments. There will be, non-substantive issues in there. They will find if there's any inconsistency, they'll point that out. Some of them were just specific typo changes, but then also some comments on, questions on why we had established things as we had in our charter. So, for instance, one of the substantive questions that the BIA had was they noticed that the meeting requirements for the corporation's board of directors, those had a shorter time frame for notice before. I want to say we provide like a 3-day notice for emergency meetings for the corporation's board. But then meetings with the tribal council were required to have a much longer time period. And so the BIA noticed and said, hey, your notice requirements are inconsistent here. Was this a mistake? And for this situation, we were able to let the BIA know. They had requested that we change them so that they matched and they both had the same meeting timeframes. And we responded, no, we intentionally wanted different timeframes because we envisioned situations where there might be emergencies and we need our corporate board to get together much more quickly and act on an emergency. And then we also recognize that our tribal council has a much bigger agenda, has a lot of other issues that they're working on. And so they may need a little more time before they can come together and hear a matter. So we gave them a longer notice requirement. And so we just provided that explanation to the BIA as to why that we weren't going to be adopting their change. Some of the other things that they pointed out to us was they had requested that it was very clearly stated that tribal citizens have access to the books and records of the corporation because the corporation is owned by the tribe. And so the members, they felt that the members needed to have access to it. And so we included some language outlining what that would look like. It was kind of standard procedure on access to books and records, at a reasonable time, at a reasonable location. But we included that language in there. Another point that we discussed with the BIA was the financial records and requiring that they be audited by an independent certified public accountant. So we made sure that was clearly stated in our charter. So after all of those reviews, then the regional office sent the technical comment letter. So that's that action item that you see at step 4. You'll get that technical comment letter back. So then the tribe, as I was discussing, reviewed those comments and we prepared a response letter to the BIA. And we identified when we were going to be adopting some of their comments, when we were clarifying information related to their comments, and if we were rejecting one of their comments and why we were doing that. We also had the ability to get on the phone and speak with people at the regional office to, kind of discuss some of these issues as well. So it was very helpful to get that technical comment letter and to provide a written response to those comments. We also then went through and updated the charter. We had a new draft. So then the action item at this point was a new tribal resolution adopting the revised charter and again approving that revised charter for submission to the BIA. We reached out to the BIA and asked them, how do you want this? And so we sent them a PDF clean copy of the revised charter. It did not need to say amended because we hadn't adopted yet. So we're just still at a new draft. And we were making sure to identify what version draft we were at. And I think we had been, whether we're at version 10 or version 11. And we also provided them red line copy of our new version compared to the version that they had provided comments to. Going back a little ways, when we were working with the BIA, one thing we did also was reach out to them and ask how they wanted to receive documents. So that way we knew if we had to send things, certified mail overnight, if they wanted, PDFs, hard paper copies, electronic versions, if they wanted just those to be PDFs or Word documents that they were going to be making edits and revisions to. We reached out to clarify so we knew what that was and could provide them the packet in the format that they needed rather than sending it off to them and waiting to hear for them to come back and say, oh, actually, can you send us a Word version? So just some little practice tips on how to kind of help the process move a little more smoothly. So step 6. At this point, then the tribal operations officer at the region will receive the tribe's revised charter and our letter in response to their technical comment letter, and the new resolution of the tribal council approving that. Talk to your regional office because they may not require a new resolution. They may just need a letter signed by the chairman saying, yes, the tribe is accepting these comments and resubmitting this tribal Section 17 charter. Another practice tip is whether some of those edits might be just stylistic of things not substantive. No one on our team was trying to take a personal credit for how the document looked. We were simply trying to get the Section 17 approved and set up. So there may have been some edits in there and some changes that we may have looked at and thought about, but if it wasn't going to make a substantive difference, it may not have been worth the time and energy to argue and go back and forth about it. We were trying to be efficient and get this approved so that we can continue on with the business transaction. One thing that was also interesting for us is when we came down to the end, it was right at the same time as federal government shutdown that happened right before Christmas. I believe that was in 2018. So we were at a point where it was like December 17th when the tribe had scheduled its tribal council meeting to approve the revised charter. And we were going to be overnighting that, and it was going to tribal operations on like December 19th or 20th. But that was at the same time then that the federal government started shutdown. And then what happened after that is the Christmas holidays. So we had to come up with some contingency plans, and we really worked with the regional tribal operation officer who made sure that she had updated the regional director who would be acting during the government shutdown, that this was coming, that these were the issues that we had worked on. These are the corrections that were coming. She had all the paperwork in place necessary for the internal memo to go through, for the regional director to receive it and sign the final certificates. So we kind of really worked concurrently with the tribe, with the BIA, to make sure that we were prepared for this to get approved, even with the government shutdown. And that is ultimately what happened. The regional director, the government shutdown happened. We were down to just the regional director, who then we had to communicate with right after Christmas. And he was the one who confirmed by phone that he was had received it, reviewed it, and was going to be signing it. And then ultimately sent an email copy with a paper copy to follow up. And And at this point, then, so we have our certificate and approval by the BIA. So that came back to the tribe. So you're now to step 7, the last process. And that is for the tribe to ratify the Charter of Incorporation. And the ratification has to be done through tribal resolution. And along with the ratification, then you finally, the tribe gets to sign its charter. And that is when the charter becomes effective, when you have that tribal ratification and signature on the charter. Your Section 17 is then ready to go and ready to operate. There's a few other pieces that are involved with kind of the startup for that Section 17 business, though. We had bylaws that we had drafted, and so we wanted to get those also approved. And we also had individuals that were identified to be on the initial board of directors for the corporation. And there was some other business for the specific entity that we were creating, and the business transaction it was created for. So rather than putting all of that into one comprehensive tribal resolution that would name the board of directors and appoint them and ratify the charter and adopt the bylaws, we broke all those out into separate resolutions. And we did this for confidentiality and for ease of revising other documents. We didn't want to run into an issue later on down the road where, say, we only have one resolution approving everything, but we want to amend the bylaws. And so we need another resolution amending the bylaws. Or if, to also keep that confidentiality, if the board was going to be, say, opening a bank account or engaging some other practice, and so a board member needed the resolution appointing them, we didn't want to be handing over the resolution that also authorized the creation of the charter or the adoption of the bylaws. So it ended up with a lot of work for that day, a lot of specific separate resolutions. But I think in the long run, it allows the tribe to, keep those matters separate when they're considering those and working on different revisions in those areas. So here I have, this is the example language. This is specifically what the certificate of approval states. It has the regional director referencing the authority that comes from the IRA and how it's been delegated, and that they are issuing the Federal Charter of Incorporation for use by the tribe. And it specifically will call it the name of the tribe and the name of the corporation. And it is that exact language on a Word document. And that was the certificate. So I just wanted to provide an example of what that would look like. So it was a really interesting process. Hopefully you've learned a lot. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I mentioned I had some of the statistics. So again, these are numbers of where things were at right when COVID was starting. And at that point, there'd only been 247 Section 17 corporations approved ever, which was really shocking to me because it seems like a small amount. But then when you look at the numbers for 2019, there was only 13 charters that had been requested. You see the Pacific region having 7, so they seem like they're a little more active in that area. But where I'm located in the Midwest region, there was no one seeking a Section 17 corporation that year. And we were fortunate. We got ours completed in about 6 months, which was really expedited, and I think took a lot of work on all parties involved. But we also, or what I discovered is, so it was in 2020 when I got this information, that there were still 4 charters that were awaiting approval that had been filed in 2019, and the BIA was going to be kind of looking into seeing where those were at. So it's kind of, those numbers are low from what I would expect. The Reservation Economic Summit last March in Vegas had a session on Section 17 corporations, and the BIA was seeking some meaningful input from tribes and tribal businesses on how they can improve this Section 17 process and how they can make it consistent across the regions. Again, that was right before COVID, so I'm not sure how that is working out now, if there's been much activity in that area or not, but certainly it sounds like something that's on their radar. So here's a few different references for Section 17 corporations, areas that you can get some more information on. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Hope you learned a lot. Please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.